Most intermediate guitarists understand triads as shapes or boxes, so if triads feel stiff, mechanical, or hard to use in your playing, don't worry, because in this video I'm going to show you a way to unlock a hidden layer of the fretboard to actually apply triads melodically. And once you see this, you won't look at the fretboard the same way again. If this is your first time here, I'm Stip. I'm a Brazilian guitarist in Australia. 9 years into my guitar journey, I went from self-taught to graduating from an international music academy, learned from a few legends along the way, and I help intermediate guitarists level up and save time by practicing the right things in the right order. Here's how we'll go about tackling the practical melodic use of triads in this video. We're gonna first understand what makes triads hard to apply and what are the main issues most people face, and then I'll show practical methods you can instantly start using to naturally bring the triads to your playing and stop struggling so much with them. It's also important to mention that I'm only going to be covering closed triads here. I won't go over open triads because closed triads are already powerful enough on their own to have a dedicated video, and if we don't have them down, then moving on to the universe of open triads makes no sense. It'll only be making things more confusing and overwhelming. So triads are one of those subjects that I think best represents the idea of easier said than done, and that happens for a few reasons. Triads are relatively basic and simple subject in the sense that they're usually pretty easy to understand. There's not much in terms of properly understanding them that goes beyond the fundamental root, third, and fifth notion, and they're also something that's usually introduced and taught early on before every other element except for pentatonics and maybe the major scale. So you could say that they're surely part of the starter pack when it comes to music. But even though they're right next to subjects like the pentatonic scale, which is something that most people can immediately start applying effectively as soon as they learn in their first contacts, triads are not as friendly in those terms. If you've ever tried to, for example, improvise using nothing but triads, you've probably felt your brain burn a little bit because it's really not an easy task. A good practical way to think about why that happens is the following. Let's take this to the extreme and imagine two cases in which we want to phrase fluently across the guitar neck. In the first case, we can only use one note, for example, the note C. And on the second case, I can use every note that's available on the guitar. Let's see how would that go, and very importantly, keep in mind that what we'll analyze first here has nothing to do with key, but simply with phrasing fluency. Okay, we'll get there step by step. As you can see, naturally having more notes available to use enables a much richer and diverse flow of ideas and makes it possible to move in any direction, connect any kind of idea and phrase in a completely free way. And I did this extreme comparison here of having one note versus every note available to make the practical point that the more notes a given tool has, the easier it is to be creative with it, because we have more possibilities, we have more places to go, which is not the same as saying it is easier. My point here is specifically about flow of ideas. And the least notes we have, the more naturally limited we are. And guess what? Out of all the melodic tools we have, triads are the one that have the least number of notes. So melodically, when we have 3-note arpeggios, 4-note arpeggios, 5-note scales, 6-note scales, 7-note scales, 8-note scales, 12-note scales, the tool that's the closest to the 1-note extreme example are triads, which of course have only 3 notes. So it reaches the loop, or the point where it starts repeating itself and requiring some other way of being creative to avoid sounding like an exercise, way earlier than everything else. As an example, a situation I constantly went through when I was in music school was that I would find way easier to improvise with, or just to generally use 7th arpeggios like major 7th, minor 7, dominant, half diminished, than triads, even though they are objectively more complex subjects, and most of it is basically due to that linearity that the extra note gives us in relation to triads, which feel more closed, more compact, more limited, so closer on the spectrum to that 1-note thing. So that's the first thing I would say makes triads especially tough in their usage, and as we'll see, everything will be connected. This is also very close linked to the fact that triads also have a somewhat large interval gap between each note. So if we compare it to scales, those will constantly have half steps and whole steps, which make the melodic paths way more comfortable and inviting to explore. But with triads, we'll always necessarily be talking about thirds, major or minor. So I think it becomes clear how a tool that in theory is basic can actually be something pretty tough to handle, because you'll always be dealing with a small group of fairly distant notes. And I would also say that one of the things that throws people off the most is caused probably by the main problem of the overall guitar learning environment, which is the shape culture. So basically reducing the understanding of different tools we have, which have deep musical meaning, as simply geometric shapes across the fretboard. The most immediate way this relates to what we're talking about is that what is understood as the meaning of using a certain tool like triads is playing the corresponding shape. So to feel like you're actively using a triad, you might instinctively reach out for a triad shape, like. And so the shape in this case is really a trap, because it's inviting you precisely straight into the things we've established here as the main problems. So doing it this way is almost impossible for it to not sound robotic or like an exercise. Okay, so now we understand what's up. So what can we do about it? The first thing I'd say is that the idea of soloing purely with triads is simply not common. So it can be used as a great exercise to better visualize the triads and deal with limitations as a way of learning how to push your creativity forward by making the most of what you have available. Totally, absolutely. But in the end, when it comes to actual real world practical soloing, scales will absolutely be present. It's almost impossible for someone to be soloing naturally and spontaneously using only triads and to not sound at least a little bit square. So to effectively use triads, the first solution I want to talk about comes from understanding that in order to do exactly this, to use a triad, by definition, you need to simply pass through the three notes that make up the triad. It might sound kind of obvious, but most people don't think that way. That almost instantly makes it way easier. So we need to get rid of the idea that a triad means the entire shape that goes from the sixth to the first string. That unconsciously drives us to both understand the triad as something way larger than it is, and to naturally try to use the whole extension of the shape without need for it, because we would be learning the shape and we might feel like we have to use the whole thing, so we feel like we're using the triad. We have to remember that this shape and this extension is only given to us like that because of how the guitar is built. No other instrument thinks about triads that way. If we take a C major triad, for example, C, E, G, and we're not actively thinking about that, it'll be very easy to end up trying to use the triad like that. But what's important to consider is that by the time we've played at least 3 notes anywhere inside this entire structure, that means in the most literal and objective way that we've used that triad. So what I want you to understand here is that you can have your melodic bass in something like the C major scale, for example. And within the scale phrasing, you can have many different connections you can do using these little 3-note bridges. So for example, here I have the scale. I have the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7, root, and then I have the triad here. So I can play root, 3rd, 5th. So this is a way I literally applied the entire triad here without needing to do the whole shape. So I can do I used the triadic movement here, and that's the thing, is the most straightforward definition of using the triad possible, because I used literally the 3 notes of the triad. So it's about breaking the mentality that the meaning of the triad is that whole extension of the shape. So here, phrasing a little bit more using the C major scale. The triad, root, 3rd, 5th here, so I used it naturally inside the playing. It was there bridging a little part of the scale. You'll quickly start to understand the triads as powerful tools, powerful allies in your phrasing to help you create and connect ideas and travel creatively through the neck rather than some clunky and practical shape that almost always sounds like an exercise. So the triads here can have precisely the opposite effect. You can use them to break some of the scale sections and get more variety of melodic paths, the classic breaking out of scale boxes, right? Since the scale will naturally have roots, thirds, and fifths in its structure, wherever these intervals exist, there's the possibility of pulling a triad movement from there and adding some of that special sauce. So the triad will be present inside the scale because naturally the scale will have the root, will have a third, and will have a fifth, and the triad made of these intervals. So in my C major scale I could be playing 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here in the 5. So my 5 here is G. So I can play 5, 1, 3, right? So I can play G, C, E. So G, C, E. That's a C major triad. So doesn't sound like the boxy thing. It sounds like a good little melodic movement that's happening more naturally inside. So I gave an example from the fifth. If I started from the third, so in my C major scale I have C, 1, 2, D, 3, E. Okay, so from this, if my triad is C, E, G, and I'm starting from the E, I can play E, G, C. So that's a C major triad over E. Okay, so E, G, C. Here's my triad. So pulling the C major triad from the root note, for example. So here, C, E, G, right? So here from the third, E, G, C, C, E, G. Here I'm on the fifth, G. So after G we have C and E, right? So G, C, E. That's a C triad. So from here. That's phrasing using triads, literally using triads in the most direct way possible. C, E, G, that's the definition of the triad, which is very different from trying to use from the shape, which would be like, okay, I'm phrasing in C major, and then suddenly like, then you fall into those problems we've been talking about. By the way, if you like how these phrases mixing elements like scales and arpeggios sound like, and you want to have some of these cards up your sleeve, you'll definitely want to check the video I made breaking down 3 very nice licks that use multiple tools like these. It's the first link in the description and in the fixed comment. So having a good visualization of these triads will also be very handy in terms of knowing where the target notes of the chord are located. So a huge advantage that triads have against scales is that triads only have target notes. They might not sound very interesting by themselves if you're only playing target notes all the time, because it'll be lacking colors and some tension and release that comes from playing notes that are not part of the chord. But if you study them well, you end up with a very solid map of target notes that merges perfectly with the scale. So I know where all of the target notes are because of the triad study. So by now this video is starting to get kind of long, so here's what I'll do. I'll pause my lecture about triads here so you can practice these things we went over so far without getting overwhelmed with too many different concepts, angles, approaches at once. And if you'd like me to do a sequence showing more practical ways of using triads, if you're enjoying this process, because there are many more, leave a comment below saying part 2 so I can know this is something you're interested in. So have a great practice session, and I'll see you in the next video. And again, don't forget to check the video in the link below to see these licks and how I piece them together, mixing some of these different elements.